My brother-in-law grabbed the microphone at my promotion dinner in front of my entire company and announced that the startup I built from nothing actually belonged to him. Then a federal attorney seated 3 chairs away set down her wine glass and stood up, and the look on his face was something I will never forget for the rest of my life. I need to back up, because if I just start there, you won't understand why it hit the way it did. You won't understand what it cost me to sit at that table and keep smiling while he said it. My name is Sloan. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 6 years I have run a software company called Groundline. We build compliance tools for mid-size logistics companies. Not glamorous, I know, but it is mine. Every line of code in the original build, every cold call I made from my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, every client I flew across the country to pitch with a maxed out credit card in my wallet. Mine, built from the ground up in the 2nd bedroom of a condo I could barely afford after I left my corporate job at 26, with nothing but a severance check and what my mother called that stubborn look. By the time of the dinner, my company's 6th anniversary, which our board had insisted on celebrating at a private room in one of the nicer restaurants downtown, Groundline had just closed a Series B funding round. It was the kind of number that makes your hands shake when you see it in writing for the first time. We had 41 employees. We had a waiting list of clients. I had just been featured in a regional business magazine, which I was quietly very proud of and pretended to find mildly embarrassing whenever anyone brought it up. My sister had been married to her husband, Curtis, for 4 years. I had tried, for those 4 years, to like him. I want to be honest about that. I genuinely tried. He was charming in the way that people who are always performing charm tend to be: always the loudest laugh in the room, always the first to offer a toast, always just slightly too interested in the details of other people's finances. He called himself a business development consultant, which, as far as I could tell, meant he made a lot of calls that never quite turned into anything, and attended a lot of networking events where he collected business cards he never followed up on. When I first launched Groundline, my sister mentioned it to him at a family dinner, and he immediately pivoted into a 20-minute monologue about how he had been thinking about a very similar concept for years. He hadn't. But I smiled and said, "Small world," and passed the breadbasket. Over the years, as Groundline grew, his interest in it sharpened from casual into something else. He started asking questions that felt less like curiosity and more like inventory. What was my monthly recurring revenue? Did I have a co-founder? Who owned the IP? Was I considering taking on a business partner? I answered vaguely and changed the subject, and each time I drove home from a family dinner, I mentioned it to my husband, Felix, who would squeeze my hand and say, "He's harmless, just insecure." Felix is a high school history teacher and the most grounded person I have ever met in my life, and I trust his read on people almost always. This time, I think we were both wrong. 6 months before the dinner, my sister called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She was using her soft voice, the one she uses when she wants something and is hoping I won't notice. She said, Curtis had been going through a rough patch. A deal had fallen through. Some money had gotten tied up in a temporary situation she didn't want to get into, and she wanted to know if there was any role at Groundline that might be a good fit for him. She framed it as temporary, just while he got back on his feet. I told her I'd think about it. I brought it up with Felix that night, who made a face, but said it was my call. I brought it up with my business attorney, a woman named Harriet, who has been my lawyer since year 1, and who responded to my summary of the situation with about 3 seconds of silence before saying, "What kind of role?" I said I was thinking of something in sales outreach, low stakes, no equity, contractor basis. Harriet said, "Put it in writing, everything." I said I would. I didn't, because he turned it down. He said contractor was beneath him and that he'd expected more. I told my sister I was sorry it didn't work out and figured that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. 2 months later, my mother called. She had also been talking to Curtis, apparently. She told me, gently, the way my mother tells me everything she considers bad news, that Curtis felt he deserved some recognition for his early contributions to Groundline. I asked her what early contributions. She said he had mentioned some conversations we'd had in the early days, some ideas he'd thrown out at family dinners. I sat very still and said, "Mom, Curtis has never contributed anything to my company. Not an idea, not a dollar, not an hour." She said, "I'm sure he doesn't mean it literally, honey. He's just struggling." I said I understood, and I loved her, and we hung up, and I sat at my desk for a very long time after that. I mentioned it to Harriet. She said to document everything. I started keeping notes. The dinner was a Friday night in October. The private room at the restaurant fit our whole team comfortably, plus a handful of board members and a few of our key investors and advisors. My sister and Curtis were there as family guests. Felix was there. My parents were there, seated next to my sister, looking proud in the way that made my chest feel full and aching all at once. At the table, to my right, was a woman named Deb. Deb was a federal attorney who had recently joined our advisory board, a referral from one of our investors who said she had a sharp eye for compliance issues and scale risk. She was quiet and precise, and had the kind of stillness about her that made you feel like she was always listening to at least two conversations at once. I had only met her twice before, but I liked her enormously. Curtis was across the table, 2 seats to the left. He was wearing a blazer that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, and he had already refilled his wineglass twice during the appetizer course. My sister looked lovely, and a little strained, the way she always looks when she's hoping Curtis will behave, and isn't entirely sure he will. The speeches started the way they always do. Our COO, my first hire, said some genuinely kind things and made most of the room tear up a little. One of our board members talked about where we'd been and where we were going. Felix caught my eye from across the table and mouthed something that made me laugh out loud, which broke the emotion of the moment in the best possible way. Then, Curtis stood up. He hadn't been asked to speak. There was no program that included him. He just picked up his wineglass, pushed back his chair, and stood up with the easy confidence of a man who has never once considered that a room might not want to hear from him. "I just want to say something," he said, loudly enough that the side conversations at the far end of the table stopped. "Because I've been sitting here listening to everyone talk about Sloane's success, and I think there's a piece of this story that doesn't get told enough." I felt Felix go very still across the table. I felt my mother's smile freeze. "A lot of people don't know this," Curtis continued, swirling his wine. "But Groundline wasn't exactly built in a vacuum. Some of us were in those early conversations. Some of us were throwing out ideas, making introductions, helping Sloane think through the concept when it was just a napkin sketch." He chuckled. "I'm not saying I want a trophy. I just think it's worth acknowledging where ideas come from." "Right, Sloane?" He looked at me. The whole table looked at me. 3 of my employees were visibly confused. One of my board members had set down his fork. I kept my face very calm. I had spent 6 years learning how to keep my face very calm in rooms where someone was trying to unsettle me. I said, "Curtis, that's very generous of you, but I don't think this is the right moment." "I'm not trying to take anything," he said, holding up a hand, still smiling. "I just think, look, I've been doing some research about co-founder recognition, about how courts have looked at intellectual contribution in early-stage companies. And I think there might be some really productive conversations to have. About equity, about acknowledgement, about doing the right thing by the people who helped you get here." The word courts landed in the room like he dropped a glass. My sister's face had gone white. Felix's jaw was tight. I could see my mother's hand reach over and grip my father's arm, and then Deb set down her wineglass. She didn't stand dramatically. She just set it down, very deliberately, and then she straightened in her chair and looked at Curtis with an expression that I can only describe as the professional equivalent of a door closing. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice level and unhurried. "I don't think we've met properly. I'm Deb. I'm a federal attorney and I serve on Sloane's advisory board." She paused. "Did you just reference litigation as a dinner toast?" Curtis blinked. "I was just. Because what I heard," Deb continued, without raising her voice even slightly, "was a public claim of equity interest in a privately held company, followed by a reference to legal action, in front of the company's board members and investors." She tilted her head. "That's not a toast. That's a threat. and depending on how it was intended, it could constitute tortious interference. The room was absolutely silent. I wasn't threatening anyone, Curtis said, and for the first time the confidence in his voice had something hollow underneath it. Then I'd sit down, Deb said pleasantly, and I'd stop talking. He sat down. My sister was looking at the table. My mother's hand was still on my father's arm. 3 of my employees were doing that thing where they're trying very hard not to look at each other. Felix, across the table, was looking directly at me, and his expression was not satisfied exactly, more like, I see you. You're okay. I've got you. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and thanked everyone for coming. The rest of the dinners was quiet in the way that things get quiet after a pressure drop. People talked, the food was good, someone made a joke about the Series B that got a real laugh. But Curtis didn't say another word, and my sister spent most of the rest of the evening staring at a spot just past my left shoulder. As people were starting to gather their coats, Deb appeared at my elbow. Are you all right? She asked. Yes, I said. And then, because she was Deb and I didn't feel like performing, I don't know. It's my brother-in-law. I know, she said. It's always worse when it's family. She was quiet for a moment. What he described, the early conversations, the idea contributions, is that anything that could have legs? No, I said. He came to a few family dinners in my first year. He talked at me about his opinions. He never put in $1 or a day or a document. Do you have records from that period? Incorporation docs, early IP filings, development logs? Yes, Harriet, my attorney. She structured everything from month 1. Deb nodded slowly. Call her Monday. Tell her what happened tonight. What he said publicly, in front of witnesses, is actually useful for you if he does try to push this further. She looked at me steadily. Don't contact him. Don't let your sister try to broker a conversation. Anything he wants to say, he says to Harriet. I nodded. Thank you. 4. Stepping in. She shook her head slightly. I didn't do it as a favor. I did it because what he was doing was wrong and I was in the room. She picked up her coat. Good night, Sloan. Congratulations on the Series B. You built something real. Felix found me a few minutes later, and we stood together in the lobby while he helped me into my coat, and he didn't say anything about Curtis at all, just put his arm around my shoulder and said, That food was actually really good. The salmon especially. I laughed, and it came out shakier than I expected. On the way home, I called Harriet and left a voicemail even though it was almost 10 o'clock on a Friday, because she had told me once, if something happens, don't wait till Monday morning when it's already cloudy in your head. Tell me while it's fresh. She called me back in 11 minutes. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I respect most about her. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then she said, Good. He did it publicly, in front of an attorney and your board. That's actually the best possible place for him to have done this, from our perspective. I asked her what she meant. She said, A private claim is messy. He could later say he was misunderstood, that it was a personal conversation, that you're exaggerating. But he stood up in a room full of professional witnesses and made a public statement about equity interest and referenced courts. Deb heard it. Your board heard it. Your employees heard it. That's on record now. She paused. I'm going to draft a cease and desist first thing Monday. I'm also going to pull everything from your incorporation through your first year. Every filing, every timestamp, every development log, and put it in a package. If he makes one more move, we'll be ready. She also said gently that I should be prepared for my sister to call, and my mother, and possibly my father, and that no matter how much I wanted to smooth it over, I needed to let those calls go to voicemail until Harriet gave me the green light. They're going to say he made a mistake, she said, that he was drinking, that you're overreacting, and maybe some of that is even true. But Sloan, a man who references courts in a toast at your company dinner, has thought about this. Drunk or not, that doesn't happen by accident. I knew she was right. I had known it somewhere since the call with my mother 2 months before. I just hadn't wanted to know it out loud. I let the calls go to voicemail. All of them. My sister called 3 times Saturday morning. My mother called twice. My father left one message, which was the hardest. Just his voice, a little rough, saying, Sweetheart, I think we need to talk. I just want to understand what happened. I listened to that 4 times and cried a little and then didn't call back. On Sunday afternoon, I got a text from my sister. It said, "He didn't mean it the way it came out. He'd had too much to drink. You know how he gets. Please don't blow this up." I read it twice and put my phone face down on the counter. On Monday morning, Harriet sent the cease and desist. It outlined, in very clean legal language, that Curtis had made a public claim of intellectual and equity contribution to Groundline with no basis in fact or documentation, that any further pursuit of such claims would be met with legal action for defamation and tortious interference, and that all future communication regarding this matter should be directed to her office. It was delivered to his home address by certified mail. According to my sister, who called Harriet directly, which Harriet handled with a level of professionalism I genuinely admire. Curtis opened it at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a very long time. 2 days after the cease and desist, they showed up at my office. I know. I should have been surprised. I wasn't. My assistant buzzed me. "Your sister and a man are here. They don't have an appointment." I said to give me 2 minutes and then send them in. I also sent a text to Harriet that said, "They're here." She responded in 30 seconds, "I'm listening. Keep your phone on the table." I set my phone face up next to my keyboard and I waited. My sister came in first. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red at the edges and she was holding her purse with both hands in front of her like a shield. Curtis came in behind her. He was wearing a fleece zip-up and looked, for the first time in 4 years of knowing him, genuinely uncertain. "We just want to talk," my sister said. "Can we just talk?" I gestured to the 2 chairs across my desk. They sat. "I want to understand," I said. "Not defend myself. Not argue. I actually just want to understand. Curtis, when did you start believing you had contributed something to Groundline?" He shifted in his chair. "I'm not. Look, I've watched you build this thing for 6 years. I've been there. I've listened. I've been a sounding board. And I've watched you get all this recognition and I just..." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "Louise talked to a lawyer," he said, and then looked immediately like he wished he hadn't. I blinked. "Louise?" "My business coach," he said. "She said that in certain cases, consistent involvement in early-stage conversations can constitute..." "Curtis," I kept my voice very flat, "I need you to stop talking about what Louise told you, because I have an attorney listening to this conversation right now. And anything you say about pursuing a legal claim is going to be documented." My sister made a small, strangled sound. Curtis went pale. "You're recording this. My attorney is on my phone," I said. "You were informed in the cease and desist that all communication should go through her office. You're in my office instead. So yes." A voice came from my phone, calm and professional. "Curtis, this is Harriet. I represent Sloan. I'd strongly advise you to stop discussing any legal theories about Groundline right now. If you have a legitimate claim, which the documentation does not support, the appropriate channel is through your own attorney, not a surprise visit to my client's workplace." A pause. I'd also note that showing up here after receiving a cease and desist could be construed as harassment. "I'd encourage you both to leave." My sister stood up so fast, her chair scraped the floor. "I told him not to come," she said, and her voice cracked. I told him this was a mistake." Curtis was still staring at my phone. He looked like a man watching a ceiling fall in slow motion. Not yet hit, but certain it was coming. "I've given you money," I said quietly. "Not because you asked, but because you're family and I wanted to. I have bought you dinners and covered the difference when a lease fell through and sent gift cards when things were tight. I have done all of that without keeping score, because that's what you do for people you love." I let that sit for a moment. "But I will not give you a piece of my company. I will not rewrite history. And I will not let you stand up in front of the people I work with and imply that I owe you something I don't." Curtis finally looked at me. The performer was gone. There was just a tired, embarrassed man in a fleece zip-up. "I know," he said, barely audible. "I know you don't owe me anything. Then why?" I asked. He didn't answer. I think, honestly, he didn't know. Or he did know, and saying it out loud. That he was jealous, that watching me succeed for 6 years while he floundered had quietly eaten something in him. was more than he could manage in that moment. My sister touched his arm. "Let's go," she said softly. This time there was no fight left in either of them. They left. I sat in the silence of my office for a long time. Then I texted Harriet. "They're gone." She called immediately, and we talked through next steps for 20 minutes. No new claims had been made, no further legal threats, which meant the cease and desist was holding. She told me to document the visit in writing that same day while it was fresh, note the time, who was present, and what was said. I did it before I took my lunch break. The fallout moved in phases, the way family fallout always does. My sister went quiet, not angry quiet, just quiet, the kind that comes from being caught between two people you love and realizing you have been for months carrying water for the wrong one. She texted me a week later. "I'm sorry. I should have shut this down before it got here. I didn't know about Louise until he told you. I'm embarrassed and I'm sorry." I didn't respond right away. I sat with it for a few days, the way you do when you want to make sure you're responding from the right place and not the hurt place. My mother called the day after the office visit, voice wobbly. She had pieced together most of what happened from my sister. She said, "I didn't know it had gotten this far. Curtis told us it was just a conversation, that he had ideas he wanted recognized." I told her as calmly as I could what actually happened, the dinner, the legal language, the office visit, the recording. She was quiet for a long time and then she said, "Your father and I owe you an apology. We should have taken what you told us more seriously months ago." That mattered to me more than I expected it to. Harriet did some digging on Louise, the business coach. What she found was not flattering. Louise ran a loosely organized consulting practice with no verifiable certifications, a history of similar advice that had resulted in at least 2 other clients receiving cease and desist letters, and a habit of charging a 15% contingency on any claim her clients successfully made. She had apparently told Curtis he had a strong foundational case, which was not true, not even a little, and had been coaching him toward the confrontation for weeks. When Harriet presented this to me, I sat with it the way I sat with a lot of things that month. My brother-in-law was not just entitled and resentful. He had been encouraged by someone who stood to profit from his grievance, who had fed his jealousy and shaped it into something he thought was a legitimate legal strategy. It didn't excuse him, but it explained him a little, in a way that made me feel something closer to sad than angry. Curtis and my sister separated 2 months after the dinner. I don't know the details. My sister didn't offer them, and I didn't ask. I do know she called me on a Sunday morning and asked if I wanted to get coffee, just the 2 of us, and I said yes. We sat across from each other at a diner near her apartment, and for the first hour we talked about everything except Curtis. Her job, my company, Felix's new obsession with sourdough, the fact that our parents had started doing yoga together at the community center, which we both found genuinely surreal. Then she wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and said, "I knew he was struggling. I didn't know how bad it had gotten, how much he had built up about you in his head. I thought I could manage it. I kept thinking if I just kept the peace he'd settle down." She looked up at me. "I'm sorry I asked you to keep the peace too." I looked at my sister, my older sister, who used to let me sleep in her bed during thunderstorms, who drove 3 hours to sit with me the night my first business deal fell apart, and I said, I know you were trying." "I should have believed you," she said. "When you told Mom it wasn't real, I should have backed you up." "Yeah," I said, "you should have." She nodded. She didn't argue or qualify it, just nodded. We sat there a little longer than we needed to, ordering second coffees we didn't really want, because neither of us wanted to be the one to end it. There was never a dramatic courtroom scene. Curtis never filed anything, because there was nothing to file. Harriet's package of documentation made that clear enough that even Louise's coaching couldn't spin it into a viable claim. The cease and desist sat in his file. He got a job, eventually, at a property management company in another part of the state. I heard this from my mother, neutrally, the way she now delivers information about him, like a news ticker, factual and brief. Groundline closed out that fiscal year with our strongest revenue numbers to date. We hired 8 more people. I promoted my COO to president and gave myself, for the first time in 6 years, 2 actual weeks off. Felix and I drove up the coast with no set itinerary, stayed in 3 different inns, ate a lot of very good seafood, and talked about everything and nothing in a way that felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a very long time. Deb sent me a message when we announced our year-end numbers. Just one line, "You built something that lasts. Well done." I printed it out and taped it to the wall behind my monitor, which is very unlike me, but I did it anyway. My sister came to our holiday party. She came alone, and she looked lighter than she had in years. A little tired still, but lighter. She hugged Felix first and then me, and when she pulled back she was crying slightly, which made me cry, which made Felix hand us both cocktail napkins with a patience that I find endlessly reassuring. My parents were there too. My mom found me in the kitchen at some point during the evening, when I was refilling the charcuterie board, because it's a company party, and I still cannot help treating it like a dinner I'm hosting. She put her hand on my arm and said, "You did good, baby. You did everything right." I told her I didn't feel like I'd done everything right, she said. "Nobody does. But you protected what was yours, and you still had room for your sister at the end. That's not nothing." I thought about that on the drive home. The city lights through the window, Felix humming something quietly under his breath, the familiar weight of a long day settling into a long night. 6 years of building something in rooms where people told me it wouldn't work, in early mornings and late phone calls, and the specific loneliness of making decisions that are entirely yours to make. I had protected it. Not just the company, though yes, the company, every hard-won piece of it, but also something quieter than that. Some sense of my own ground, the knowledge of what I had actually done, separate from what anyone else needed to believe about it. Ground line is still here, still mine, still growing, and so am I.